as well as your preparation in order for you to testify. I know a lot went into this, especially reading your written testimony and then hearing you today, so thank you very much. Once again, Jimmy Panetta, I'm from the Central Coast of California. Obviously, low on the totem pole here on the Ways and Means. So, that's what happens. Not many people sticking around for my questions, and then my questions are probably repetitive, which they're going to be, considering a lot of people have asked some pretty good questions, and you gave some really substantive answers. So I appreciate it. But I do want to hear about a couple things. I'm going to focus on Dr. Jha for the first question, and then you two over here for the second question. Sorry, Mr. Wright. Dr. Jha, like I said, I come from the Central Coast. It's also known, and my colleagues get sick and tired of me saying this, as a salad bowl of the world. One of the most productive areas when it comes to soft fruits and vegetables. But it's also one of the most vulnerable when it comes to climate change. And obviously, you've heard a lot about farm workers, which is understandable, what happens to them, what can happen to them when they're subject to a lot of the things that go into agriculture. But also, I hear from the farmers as well, and their worry about what you heard some of my colleagues talk about, their industry getting wiped out. Just a general question to you. How can government work with the agriculture community to ensure both the sustainability and the continued health of our food supply?
It's a fundamentally important question, Congressman, because an effective food supply, a plentiful food supply, is critical to the nutrition and the health needs of our nation. So what we know from climate change is that climate change, and Dr. Marvel over here, she'd attest to this, that the effects of precipitation, the heat effects, all really do threaten the food supply of our country. And so it's obviously critically important that we begin to address fundamental underlying issues of climate change, burning of fossil fuels, and the air pollution that comes along. But we also have to, I think, strengthen our food supply much more broadly. One of the things that we've seen in major storms and other things is the impact on supply chain. So you can have great production, but that food can rot because you can't get it to the places that you need. That's a place where I think the government can play a helpful role. Obviously, the government has had a very substantial public health footprint in terms of ensuring the safety of the food supply. We think that role is going to have to get bigger. CDC is going to have to pay more attention. Every expectation I have is that foodborne illnesses are going to rise, and we need to ensure that Americans still have confidence in the food that they eat, and that's going to require CDC, FDA, as well as the farmers themselves.
Exactly, and I want to just stress that last part. Don't you feel that farmers, producers should be at the table when it comes to these types of discussions as well, no matter what policy is put in place?
Oh, absolutely. Any policy that does not incorporate the people who are going to be most affected by it tends to be not very good policy.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Jha. Mr. Howell said, Mr. Powell, I think Mr. Swazi, I had my question right here, and I guarantee you he took it. He's my roommate. He's known to do things like that. But I want to talk to you about the answer, the lack of answer you gave to another good friend of mine, Mr. Larson, up there, when he asked about the compromise that needs to be had as to where that dividend goes. Now, trust me, I got the Citizens Climate Lobby banging on me in my office pretty much every month, which I appreciate because we have good, fruitful discussions and where the dividend should go. And what I've told them is that I do believe that although some of the dividend could go to American families, I believe that we can affect not just American families, but we can affect this country if we continue to invest in our technology dealing with carbon output. And so once again, I want to ask both of you, is there room for you to compromise on this issue? Mr. Powell.
Thank you for the question, sir.
Mr. Powell.
Sorry?
Mr. Powell.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Please.
So first, let me just say thank you for your leadership on clean innovation technologies and particularly advanced low-emitting fossil fuel systems. I know that that's a particular area of interest for yours, and we think that those technologies are a very interesting part of the solution here.
Thank you.
I come back to just the premise of that question, which is that the funding stream would need to come from a carbon pricing proposal. I think that there are many other potential funding streams for scaling up clean, innovative technologies, including just our standard appropriations process, and that we could be getting a lot more out of the dollars we already spend on clean energy R&D if it was better focused and targeted through appropriations and through the work of your colleagues on the Energy and Commerce Committee.
Thank you. Mr. Halstead.
Thank you. I think there's broad-based consensus within the business community that this is the best plan. Why? Because they want their customers to come out ahead. The dividend is the only solution that is popular with the American public and will enable the vast majority of American families to win under a carbon pricing scenario.
And what I tell my constituents at CLC and what I'll tell you, I hope that we continue to make sure that there's some sort of compromise as to where that dividend goes to, because I think that's best for America. Thank you both. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
I want to remind the witnesses as well as the committee members that when the yellow light is yellow, you have 1 minute. Please start wrapping up so that we can end this hearing on time, beyond time. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Estes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the panelists for going through this long process and allowing us the opportunity to vote in between. You know, as we meet today, our economy is going great strides from standpoint of, you know, unemployment's at a 50-year low, the wages are increasing the fastest in 10 years, and we have more job openings than job seekers. And, you know, that incredible turnaround's been, for the large part, by the hard work that we did going through with tax cuts and regulatory reform, trying to help focus on helping make those initiatives that we value move forward. But I think we can use some of that same logic, some of that same approach, addressing some of the issues we talk about, the environment and the climate. You know, as a Kansan, I mean, Wichita is known as the air capital of the world. We do a lot of aerospace development, but also have a lot of agriculture within my district as well, and throughout the state. And I can tell you that there's no better stewards of the land and the environment than the farmers and ranchers, because not only is that their livelihood, but that's also what they want to leave to their children and grandchildren as their legacy. And so, you know, as we look at how can we move forward from here, how can we look at innovation, how can we look at regulatory changes to help make sure that we get the best practices for our climate. For too many years, you know, the Democrat approach to climate change has been, you know, how do we put in implementation ideas that actually would make energy more expensive? And now with the new policies around the Green New Deal proposal, obviously that's going to add trillions of dollars in cost in that process. And instead, I think we need to look at more clean energy opportunities. I talked about this in an op-ed that was published in The Hill this week, you know, that America can't be alone in solving this problem. For example, the Paris Climate Accord would have restricted and greatly added to the cost and the burdens on American individuals and American companies without putting limits on China and India, who actually are putting more carbon into the environment now. So we want to make sure that we don't implement a policy like some of the proposals in the Green New Deal that cost the $93 trillion, actually would take Treasury over 400 years to print that much money, and it affects every family to the tune of about $65,000 a year. So let's look at what do we do. You know, U.S. emissions have been relatively flat since 1990s, while these emissions from China and India have skyrocketed. And I think what we need to look at is what kind of practices we can put in place, what kind of policies can we put in place to help export some of our innovation, some of the things we've done to some of these other countries. Mr. Powell, you know, one of the things, I guess what I'd like to talk a little bit about is what do you think some of the best ways to reduce carbon emissions, and what should we do from a market standpoint to increase and make energy more efficient as opposed to some of the government mandated things?
Sure. Well, first, thank you for your fortitude in hanging on to the end of this fourth hour of this, and thank you all for that. You know, you mentioned exports of our technologies, which I think is a critical part of this conversation that we haven't discussed much today. Leader Brady discussed his proposal to make sure that there are no outgoing tariff barriers on these technologies going to other countries, and I think that that's very important. I'd also note that you all passed the BUILD Act last year, which establishes a new $60 billion authority under the Development Finance Corporation, which will evolve from the OPIC currently. And that authority could be an enormous tool for taking and deploying American clean energy technologies all across the developing world. That's good for our national security, because some of that could be technologies that are highly sensitive that we want to control around the world. That's great for our sort of global economic diplomacy, and it's great for emissions and energy access in a clean way around the developing world, which would also help global public health.
That's actually great. I think when you look at different options, I mean, one of the things I was able to see a couple of weeks ago, one of the companies that operates in my district, Occidental, is a partnership and a plan to develop a new electric generation facility that actually produces as much energy, but also captures the CO2 in the production process, so it doesn't have to be scrubbed out, and actually it becomes usable CO2 that they can actually then use to inject into the ground and either use in oil fields or that. You know, one of the things, you know, as we talk about some of that carbon capturing, can you talk a little bit, Mr. Powell, about the global carbon emissions from how that carbon capturing helps?
Absolutely. Recognizing I'm in the yellow, there is no more exciting technology in the world, I think, than that technology, the net power technology, which Occidental has invested in. Representative Schweikert showed a picture of that. It's a zero-emission natural gas power plant, which would be highly flexible and no more expensive than a traditional natural gas power plant.
Thank you, and I yield back.
The chair now recognizes Ms. Murphy from Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for your testimony. I live in Florida, and climate change is an existential threat to my home state. We are experiencing the consequences of climate change on a daily basis, whether that's sunny day flooding or hurricanes that are so strong that they defy categorization, harmful algae blooms that are contaminating our water supply and hurting our tourism. You know, our coastal economics face significant economic peril, and countless lives are at risk. And I believe that a crisis of this scale deserves honest conversation, bold ideas, and most importantly, action. But I think we need two things from our colleagues in order to get there. And for my Republican colleagues, they have a moral responsibility to listen to the facts and to stand up to those in their party who deny the science. You know, we can disagree on the policy approach, but we should be able to legislate from a place of fact. And we as Democrats, we have a political responsibility in a divided government to seek bipartisan progress that moves us forward. And that means being open to ideas and proposals regardless of the political affiliation of the source. So I thank Rep. Smith for requesting and the chair for entering into the record the testimony would have been testimony of former Rep. Curbelo. He's a fellow Floridian who understands these issues well, is a former colleague who's worked on them, and currently holds, I think, the most important title in a democracy, and that is of citizen. I think climate change is real, climate change is destructive, and the time for Congress to do something is now. Dr. Marvel, if we don't take any action and you look at a coastal state like Florida, can you paint me a picture of what Florida will look like, say, in 20 years for my kids and my constituents?
So a lot of times when people think about sea level rise, they think of something gradual and easy to run away from. But as I'm sure you know, one of the scariest things about sea level rise is what it does to storm surges. When the seas are higher, storm surges can reach farther inland and become more destructive. And we know, as has been mentioned by several members of this committee, that climate change happens in the world that we make for it. It affects everybody, but it doesn't affect everybody equally. We have good reason to believe that climate change will exacerbate existing inequalities and contribute to existing justice issues.
Thank you. And Mr. Powell, you know, having heard through this hearing about the severity of the issue and sort of the timing that we have, do you think that industry is currently innovating quickly enough and that developing countries are adapting on a purely economic motive quickly enough to have an impact in a timely manner given the urgency of the threat?
Absolutely not. Neither are we innovating quickly enough, nor are we adapting quickly enough given the severity of the threat. We need to accelerate both.
And how would you suggest we accelerate both?
The simplest and easiest way to accelerate both is to make the things that people can use to move more quickly more affordable and faster moving. As soon as we had shale gas in the United States, a lower emitting, better performing, cheaper alternative to traditional coal, the market took that up at an incredible pace. far faster than it took up intermittent wind and solar. Now, those are terrific technologies, but they're neither as cheap nor as high performing as shale gas. If we simply found something else like shale gas that was zero emission and cheap and high performing, like a zero emission natural gas power plant or an incredible new storage system to connect to renewables or an advanced nuclear reactor, I'd expect we could really accelerate how markets are taking up the technology around the world.
Do you think government has a role in incentivizing businesses to investigate those technologies?
Absolutely. I think the only way that this has ever happened is in public-private partnerships.
Thank you. And Mr. Wright, just shifting a little bit, you talked a little bit about adaptations as taking action today to reduce losses tomorrow. Do you think families, they say that families in America, 1 in 4 can't afford a $400, tire blowout. Do you think working families can afford the adaptations necessary to reduce the risks that they're facing?
There are some elements that are within reach and some that are beyond. You look at the kind of impact even something like Irma had working through your district, where it was those roofs that were blown off. In many ways, Tampa fared okay, and the center of the state was then hit there. As we deal with roofs, there are things that people can do for a few $100s to a couple of thousands of dollars. And while that's not accessible to everyone, it's accessible to some. But other strategies, particularly as we deal with flood, deal with very high prices in terms of what it means to elevate.
Great, thank you, and I yield back.
The chair recognizes Mr. Gomez from California.
Thank you so much. There's a buzzword that people are using here, and it's innovation. And I call it a buzzword because oftentimes when it comes to the issue of climate change and combating climate change, people said, you know what, just let the private sector innovate and it will solve everything. But that's not how it works. I come from California, where we've been dealing with different issues when it came to pollution and climate change for decades. And it was oftentimes trying to address a particular need. The need is often, let's make sure that we're not killing our own citizens with bad air or bad water. That need leads to goals. Those goals are then codified in legislation, and then legislation often spurs the innovation that's necessary in the private sector to achieve the goals, right, and achieve those needs. And yes, that leads to adaptation and job creation. But innovation just doesn't occur with the snap of a finger. It's often government setting the standard. In California, we had some of the worst air quality in the country. We still do, but at least that we don't have 125 red flag days where children can't go outside and play, where you had motorcycle cops once upon a time that would wear gas masks so they wouldn't drive in the pollution, right? We actually took steps, but those steps, the small story when it comes to the tailpipe emission standards, led to the check engine light, to the catalytic converter, led to so much innovation that people don't even recognize that it started by trying to protect people's health, right? And that's where we are when it comes to, I think, when it comes to combating climate change. We first need to recognize that there is a need. That need needs to be addressed because it's impacting people's health, it's impacting people's lives, it's impacting people's jobs, right? And that's where we need to start focusing. This committee, it's great to hear that some of my Republican colleagues believe that there is a need. There's a disagreement on how to get there, but the entire Republican caucus still isn't there. And in order to come up with those legislative ideas is important. California, we've done a lot of things well, but one of the things that we learned is that if we don't take the most disadvantaged communities into account, the ones that are disproportionately impacted by climate change and pollution, then they will be left behind. You'll have a green divide that gets exacerbated. And we started combating that in California, really to deal with seniors, immigrants, children, low-income families across the state. Mr. Jha, I wanted to ask you, when it comes to healthcare and these disadvantaged communities, what are some of the prime negative impacts you're seeing on climate change on these families? And Mr. Wright, how can we adapt some of those strategies to help them?
So, Congressman Gomez, really important question, and I'd say a couple of things. One of the issues that was brought up earlier is, if you think of this as a medical condition, you're trying to sort out, is this peptic ulcer disease, is this stomach cancer? Here's where we are if we think about climate change today. We have a population that is at substantial risk. And while I'm happy to wait for innovation, I'm happy to have innovation, we can't wait for it. We've got to start acting now. And that, to me, is the most important point of the day, is that innovation is going to be important, but there's a lot of things we can do today that will disproportionately benefit underrepresented, underserved communities, because they are the ones who are being hurt the most right now by climate change. If you think about where the air pollution is that comes from burning fossil fuels and who's really being affected by it, it's communities of color, it's people living in poor areas. So there's both a racial component and an economic justice component. And the effects are all the ones we've talked about: asthma, heart disease, exposure to new diseases. And they have profound effect on people's lives. And that really does require action.
Mr. Wright?
And then I would look at the economic impacts. You look at the Woolsey fire and other those that were in the vicinity of your district, and you look at what are we going to do, because we saw those fires generated by some of these same kind of conditions that were not just sitting right at the edge with the people who live in the homes that have the fancy backyards, but the tract homes in the middle. As we saw those embers move into the communities, there are very tangible things that we can do for a few $100s or less to help those structures make sure that they're not going to lose their home, that they are going to have a place to go after that fire comes through.
No, and I agree. And one of the things that I don't want to see is that these disadvantaged communities are left behind, because climate change doesn't discriminate if you live in a Republican district or a Democratic district. So I yield back, and I thank you for your time.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to Chairman Neal for hosting the first hearing on climate change in the Ways and Means Committee in nearly 12 years. Our leadership is serious about addressing this issue, and so am I. Climate change is real. One proposal alone isn't going to fix this massive problem. We need a serious and comprehensive policy on climate resiliency to prevent carbon emissions exceeding 2 degrees Celsius. Instead of demagoguing the issue or those who have serious concerns about the real existential threat that exists, we need to come together to set a federal policy that addresses the problem. Mr. Halstead, do you agree that this is a real issue that requires leadership at all levels, from the halls of Congress, the C-suites, and every household that plays a role in reducing emissions?
Absolutely.
I'd like to focus the remainder of my time on the cost of climate and the implications on healthcare. Today, U.S. healthcare spending has reached $3.5 trillion. That is an average of $10,739 per person per year. That's how much we spend on healthcare in this country. Healthcare spending accounts for 17.9% of our GDP. There is clear evidence that shows climate change will exacerbate health issues related to asthma, heart disease, diabetes, and cancer, as you pointed out, Doctor. I want to bring to your attention the Centers for Disease Control chart that was shared in your testimony. There are some who claim solutions to addressing climate change will cost too much. Well, we cannot afford to address real impacts of climate change on our health. The truth is, we are already paying for it, some with their very lives, and that's a cost none of us can afford. So, Doctor, your research concentrates on improving the cost effectiveness of our healthcare system. Can you please share with us how healthcare costs are growing due to climate change, and what specifically about the pharmaceutical industry can you tell me on how it is considering the impacts of climate change in that industry particularly?
So, Congressman, thank you for your question, and in many ways you've articulated a point I've tried to make all day better than I did. Let me say that we have the most expensive healthcare system in the world. In many ways, a very high-quality health system, though it is not without its challenges. What we know is that the diseases that are affected by climate change, whether it's emergency department visits for asthma or hospitalizations for heart failure, strokes, heart attacks, these are incredibly expensive to treat. And the people who are affected are the children and the elderly who are covered by public insurance. And so if we are going to be good stewards of the public dollar, focusing on climate change is essential. Now, unfortunately, because so little research has gone into the health effects of climate change, I mentioned earlier, less than 0.05% of the NIH budget goes towards studying the health effects of climate change. If climate change is the biggest public health challenge of our times, and I believe it is, the idea that you would spend less than 0.05% of a budget to study it is crazy. Right. And that has done is it hampered my ability to give you a more precise estimate, because we just don't know.
Well, what we
and
do
we
know
need to learn.
It's a cost we cannot afford.
We know it's expensive. We know it's harmful. We know it's expensive. And we need to quantify that expense because we have to factor it in.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to enter into the record this article entitled "Climate Change Could Be Big Business for Pharma," dated January 24, 2009.
So ordered.
Thank you. This is what some companies are saying. AbbVie states, climate change may create a greater need for existing or even new products. Higher temperatures and drought conditions are becoming extreme. Our immunology product line could see an increase in sales as a result. We've got statements from Eli Lilly, Merck, Pfizer. It is interesting to me that we have companies that are focused on how they can make a profit from what they can see are the impacts of climate change on healthcare, rather than working to address the issues that are contributing to climate change to begin with. And so I'd like to call upon the pharmaceutical industry, every CEO, every company, every advocate, to work with this committee and other committees of jurisdiction and let us come up with a common sense, comprehensive plan so that we can worry about the people and not the profits. And these articles can no longer be the example that we use in a committee hearing, but the real change that we want to see in our country. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I'd like to thank the witnesses for their testimony and their patience. I also want to thank the members for their participation. Please be advised that members have 2 weeks to submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. With that, the committee stands adjourned.